Part 3, Section 8 of The Age of Reason by Thomas Paine. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. I have here given the reader two sublime extracts from men who lived in ages of time far remote from each other, but who thought alike. Cicero lived before the time in which they tell us Christ was born. Middleton may be called a man of our own time, as he lived within the same century with ourselves. In Cicero we see that vast superiority of mind, that sublimity of right reasoning and justice of ideas, which man acquires, not by studying Bibles and Testaments, and the theology of schools built thereon, but by studying the Creator in the immensity and unchangeable order of his creation, and the immutability of his law. There cannot, says Cicero, be one law now, and another hereafter, but the same eternal, immutable law comprehends all nations, at all times, under one common master and governor of all, God. But according to the doctrine of schools which priests have set up, we see one law, called the Old Testament, given in one age of the world, and another law, called the New Testament, given in another age of the world. As all this is contradictory to the eternal immutable nature and the unerring and unchangeable wisdom of God, we must be compelled to hold this doctrine to be false, and the Old and the New Law, called the Old and the New Testament, to be impositions, fables, and forgeries. In Middleton we see the manly eloquence of an enlarged mind, and the genuine sentiments of a true believer in his Creator. Instead of reposing his faith on books, by whatever name they may be called, whether Old Testaments or New, he fixes the creation as the great original standard by which every other thing called the Word or work of God is to be tried. In this we have an indisputable scale whereby to measure every word or work imputed to him. If the thing so imputed carries not in itself the evidence of the same almightiness of power, of the same unerring truth and wisdom, and the same unchangeable order in all its parts, as are visibly demonstrated to our senses, and comprehensible by our reason, in the magnificent fabric of the universe, that word or that work is not of God. Let then the two books called the Old and New Testament be tried by this rule, and the result will be that the authors of them, whoever they were, will be convicted of forgery. The invariable principles and unchangeable order which regulate the movements of all the parts that compose the universe demonstrate both to our senses and our reason that its Creator is a God of unerring truth. But the Old Testament, beside the numberless, absurd, and bagatelle stories it tells of God, represents him as a God of deceit, a God not to be confided in. Ezekiel makes God to say, chapter 14, verse 9, "And if the prophet be deceived when he hath spoken a thing, I, the Lord, have deceived that prophet." And at the 20th chapter, verse 25, he makes God, in speaking of the children of Israel, to say, "Wherefore I gave them statutes that were not good, and judgments by which they could not live." This, so far from being the word of God, is horrid blasphemy against him. Reader, put thy confidence in thy God, and put no trust in the Bible. The same Old Testament, after telling us that God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, makes the same almighty power and eternal wisdom employ itself in giving directions how a priest's garments should be cut, and what sort of stuff they should be made of, and what their offerings should be, gold and silver and brass, and blue and purple and scarlet, and fine linen and goat's hair and ram's skins dyed red, and badger skins, etc. Chapter 25, verse 3. And in one of the pretended prophecies I have just examined, God is made to give directions how they should kill, cook, and eat a he-lamb or a he-goat. And Ezekiel, chapter 4, to fill up the measure of abominable absurdity, makes God to order him to take wheat and barley and beans and lentils and millet and fitches, and make a loaf or a cake thereof, and bake it with human dung, and eat it. But as Ezekiel complained that this mess was too strong for his stomach, the matter was compromised from man's dung to cow dung. Ezekiel chapter 4. Compare all this ribaldry, blasphemously called the Word of God, with the almighty power that created the universe, and whose eternal wisdom directs and governs all its mighty movements, and we shall be at a loss to find a name sufficiently contemptible for it. In the promises which the Old Testament pretends that God made to his people, the same derogatory ideas of him prevail. It makes God to promise to Abraham that his seed should be like the stars in heaven and the sand on the seashore for multitude, and that he would give them the land of Canaan as their inheritance forever. But observe, reader, how the performance of this promise was to begin, and then ask thine own reason, if the wisdom of God, whose power is equal to his will, could, consistently with that power and that wisdom, make such a promise. The performance of the promise was to begin, according to that book, by 400 years of bondage and affliction. Genesis chapter 15, verse 13. And God said unto Abraham, Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. This promise then to Abraham, and his seed forever, to inherit the land of Canaan, had it been a fact instead of a fable, was to operate in the commencement of it as a curse upon all the people and their children, and their children's children for 400 years. But the case is, the book of Genesis was written after the bondage in Egypt had taken place. And in order to get rid of the disgrace of the Lord's chosen people, as they called themselves, being in bondage to the Gentiles, they make God to be the author of it, and annex it as a condition to a pretended promise. As if God, in making that promise, had exceeded his power in performing it, and consequently his wisdom in making it, and was obliged to compromise with them for one half, and with the Egyptians to whom they were to be in bondage, for the other half. Without degrading my own reason by bringing those wretched and contemptible tales into a comparative view with the almighty power and eternal wisdom, which the Creator hath demonstrated to our senses in the creation of the universe, I will confine myself to say that if we compare them with the divine and forcible sentiments of Cicero, the result will be that the human mind has degenerated by believing them. Man, in a state of groveling superstition, from which he has not courage to rise, loses the energy of his mental powers. I will not tire the reader with more observations on the Old Testament. As to the New Testament, if it be brought and tried by that standard, which, as Middleton wisely says, God has revealed to our senses, of his almighty power and wisdom in the creation and government of the visible universe, it will be found equally as false, paltry, and absurd as the old. Without entering in this place into any other argument that the story of Christ is of human invention and not of divine origin, I will confine myself to show that it is derogatory to God by the contrivance of it, because the means it supposes God to use are not adequate to the end to be obtained, and therefore are derogatory to the almightiness of his power and the eternity of his wisdom. The New Testament supposes that God sent his Son upon the earth to make a new covenant with man, which the Church calls the covenant of grace, and to instruct mankind in a new doctrine which it calls faith, meaning thereby not faith in God, for Cicero and all true deists always had and always will have this, but faith in the person called Jesus Christ, and that whoever had not this faith should, to use the words of the New Testament, be damned. Now, if this were a fact, it is consistent with that attribute of God, called his goodness, that no time should be lost in letting poor unfortunate man know it. And as that goodness was united to almighty power, and that power to almighty wisdom, all the means existed in the hand of the Creator to make it known immediately over the whole earth, in a manner suitable to the almightiness of his divine nature, and with evidence that would not leave man in doubt, for it is always incumbent upon us, in all cases, to believe that the Almighty always acts, not by imperfect means, as imperfect man acts, but consistently with his almightiness. It is this only that can become the infallible criterion by which we can possibly distinguish the works of God from the works of man. Observe now, reader, how the comparison between this supposed mission of Christ, on the belief or disbelief of which they say man was to be saved or damned, observe, I say, how the comparison between this and the almighty power and wisdom of God demonstrated to our senses in the visible creation goes on. The Old Testament tells us that God created the heavens and the earth and everything therein in 6 days. The term 6 days is ridiculous enough when applied to God, but leaving out that absurdity, it contains the idea of almighty power acting unitedly with almighty wisdom to produce an immense work, that of the creation of the universe and everything therein in a short time. Now, as the eternal salvation of man is of much greater importance than his creation, and as that salvation depends, as the New Testament tells us, on man's knowledge of and belief in the person called Jesus Christ, it necessarily follows from our belief in the goodness and justice of God and our knowledge of his almighty power and wisdom, as demonstrated in the creation, that all this, if true, would be made known to all parts of the world in as little time, at least, as was employed in making the world. To suppose the Almighty would pay greater regard and attention to the creation and organization of inanimate matter than he would to the salvation of innumerable millions of souls, which himself had created, as the image of himself, is to offer an insult to his goodness and his justice. Now observe, reader, how the promulgation of this pretended salvation by a knowledge of and a belief in Jesus Christ went on, compared with the work of creation. In the first place, it took longer time to make the child than to make the world, for 9 months were passed away and totally lost in a state of pregnancy, which is more than 40 times longer time than God employed in making the world, according to the Bible account. Secondly, several years of Christ's life were lost in a state of human infancy. But the universe was in maturity the moment it existed. Thirdly, Christ, as Luke asserts, was 30 years old before he began to preach what they call his mission. Millions of souls died in the meantime without knowing it. Fourthly, it was above 300 years from that time before the book called the New Testament was compiled into a written copy, before which time there was no such book. Fifthly, it was above 1,000 years after that before it could be circulated, because neither Jesus nor his apostles had knowledge of, or were inspired with, the art of printing, and consequently, as the means for making it universally known did not exist, the means were not equal to the end, and therefore it is not the work of God. I will here subjoin the 19th Psalm, which is truly deistical, to show how universally and instantaneously the works of God make themselves known, compared with this pretended salvation by Jesus Christ. Psalm 19th. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night showeth knowledge. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. Their line is gone out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the earth. In them hath he set a chamber for the sun, which is as a bridegroom coming out of his chamber, and rejoiceth as a strong man to run a race. His going forth is from the end of the heaven, and his circuit unto the ends of it, and there is nothing hid from the heat thereof. Now, had the news of salvation by Jesus Christ been inscribed on the face of the sun and the moon, in characters that all nations would have understood, the whole earth had known it in 24 hours, and all nations would have believed it. Whereas, though it is now almost 2,000 years since, as they tell us, Christ came upon earth, not a 20th part of the people of the earth know anything of it, and among those who do, the wiser part do not believe it. I have now, reader, gone through all the passages called prophecies of Jesus Christ, and shown there is no such thing. I have examined the story told of Jesus Christ, and compared the several circumstances of it with that revelation, which, as Middleton wisely says, God has made to us of his power and wisdom in the structure of the universe, and by which everything ascribed to him is to be tried. The result is that the story of Christ has not one trait, either in its character or in its means employed, that bears the least resemblance to the power and wisdom of God, as demonstrated in the creation of the universe. All the means are human means, slow, uncertain, and inadequate to the accomplishment of the end proposed. And therefore the whole is a fabulous invention, and undeserving of credit. The priests of the present day profess to believe it. They gain their living by it, and they exclaim against something they call infidelity. I will define what it is. He that believes in the story of Christ is an infidel to God. Thomas Paine. End of Part 3, Section 8.